You know that phrase, right? It's simple. Everyone uses it. What goes around comes around. You hear it, well, everywhere. But what if that simple saying holds a deeper truth, a kind of fundamental principle, working across loads of different fields?
That's pretty much the core of this deep dive. We've been looking at this incredible analysis, actually. It's AI-driven, and it's synthesized insights from, well, everything. Ancient philosophy, physics, cutting-edge biology, ecology.
Wow.
And, the complexities of human behavior and ethics, too.
So our mission today is to sort of unpack this principle, see the science behind it, understand its undeniable impact on, well, everything from global systems right down to our own biology.
Wow.
And, crucially, explore how we might actually be able to shape its outcomes.
Exactly. Get ready to look at this old idiom in a completely new light. Not just as, some folk wisdom, but as a powerful, interconnected force that really governs our world.
Okay, so let's start where we all kind of encounter it first, the everyday sense. You do something good, maybe good things happen to you, act negatively, and you kind of expect something negative back, right?
At its heart, it's that intuitive recognition of a link between an action and the consequence that follows it. A cause producing an effect, basically.
And what's fascinating is just how universal this is. It pops up everywhere, across different cultures, different belief systems. It's not just an English thing.
Absolutely. The analysis really emphasizes this global presence. Like, think of Chinese proverbs, kind deeds pay rich dividends, evil is repaid with evil, or something like that. Or the very clear one, as you sow a melon, so you shall reap one. Or even simpler, the phrase we also use, you reap what you sow.
It really feels like humanity sort of independently all over the world noticed this pattern. The analysis describes this shared understanding, this recognition of cause and effect as a kind of human culture-created science, suggesting that through, collective experience and wisdom, people basically codified this predictable principle into their language, into their teachings.
And that's precisely where the AI analysis was so powerful, pulling data from all these incredibly different fields to build this holistic picture, showing how the principle actually operates in practice, revealing connections you might never have expected otherwise.
Right. Let's start digging into those foundations then. The source material points to philosophy as a key starting point, where this idea has been explored for ages. It highlights two major concepts: karma from Eastern thought and reciprocity from Western thought.
Okay, so karma, which comes from ancient Indian religions, is understood as this universal causal law. It suggests that your actions, physical, verbal, even mental, they inherently determine your future experiences, your outcomes.
But crucially, this isn't about fate being set in stone, right? Free will plays a big part here.
Precisely. It's all about choice. You make conscious decisions, and those choices generate karmic consequences. Intention is really key. Even actions that seem small, if they're rooted in strong intention, can have huge impacts down the line. And the analysis notes karma operates kind of automatically, no divine intervention needed, and it's personal. Your karma is yours alone.
Okay, so that's a cosmic law focused on the individual, often spanning lifetimes, with intention at its core. How does reciprocity, which you mentioned is more Western philosophy, compare?
Reciprocity is, well, fundamentally a social norm. It's the expectation that people will respond to others in a similar way. Kindness gets kindness back. Harm might lead to retaliation or just being excluded socially.
So more interpersonal then, within our lifetime.
Yes, exactly. Operating within social interactions, within groups. Aristotle actually talked about this in the Nicomachean Ethics. He linked it to justice and keeping social systems stable through this idea of a proportionate return. It's a cornerstone for building trust, for cooperation.
And the analysis points out it can be really powerful, sometimes even manipulative, like getting an uninvited gift can make you feel obligated.
Right. Which shows its influence goes beyond just whether you like someone. So while both karma and reciprocity are ways what goes around comes around, karma is framed as this cosmic individual law driven by intention across time. And reciprocity is more of a social, interpersonal norm driven by behavior and expectations within this life.
Got it. And kind of linking these philosophical ideas to a more scientific understanding is the fundamental law of cause and effect.
This is really the bedrock principle under it all. The analysis calls it an iron law of the universe. For every single effect, there's a specific cause that came before it. Nothing just happens randomly, by chance.
And this isn't just about physical actions, is it? Our thoughts, our emotions, they're seen as causes, too.
Yeah, exactly. Negative thinking can actually generate negative outcomes. Positive thoughts can lead towards more beneficial ones. Every conscious choice, every move you make, it initiates a causal chain. Understanding this really highlights personal responsibility and the power we have through conscious choice to shape our reality. It provides that universal framework that can hold concepts like karma and reciprocity.
Okay, so from philosophy, the analysis also finds these interesting metaphorical parallels in fundamental physics.
Yeah, the clearest one people often point to is Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. In physics, that's about forces between objects.
And metaphorically, we apply this to social dynamics. How does that work?
Well, it's used as a kind of model for understanding consequential feedback. A common example you hear is violence breeds violence. Now, obviously, the social reaction isn't perfectly equal or instantaneous like physical forces, but there's that clear sense that an action triggers some kind of counter-response or consequence down the line.
And this seems to play out on a bigger scale, too, in what's sometimes called the pendulum effect in social systems.
Right. Think about cultural trends or political movements. They often seem to swing between extremes. A strong push in one direction often tends to generate a counter-movement pushing back. It's been described, metaphorically, of course, as a kind of Newton's third law of social motion.
So, like, a period of intense social conservatism might eventually fuel a progressive pushback, or vice versa.
It's definitely a tendency we see repeated throughout history. The analysis does note it's not a strict, predictable law, and ideas like the Overton window show that the range of acceptable ideas can shift, so the return swing might not land exactly where it started, but the principle holds: action generates counter-reaction.
Okay, wow. Now, let's get into something that feels particularly impactful, how this whole what goes around comes around idea is actually showing up in biology and genetics.
This is honestly one of the most profound areas the analysis explores epigenetics. It's a relatively new field, but it's showing how your environment, your behavior, can actually influence how your genes are expressed. Basically, whether genes get turned on or off, but crucially, without changing the underlying DNA code itself.
So our genes aren't just this fixed destiny we thought they were.
Not entirely, no. Think of the epigenome as like a layer of chemical marks or instructions on top of your DNA. And these instructions can be modified by your life experiences. They regulate gene activity.
And difficult experiences can leave, like actual biological marks, scars almost.
Absolutely. The analysis talks about biological memories. Adverse experiences during really critical developmental periods, things like poor nutrition, toxins, chronic stress, they can leave these epigenetic marks. These changes get sort of built into the architecture, as the source puts it, increasing vulnerability to a whole range of poor health outcomes, later physical, mental, learning difficulties, behavioral issues, and they can last a lifetime.
Wow, so negative things in your life can literally come around as biological consequences for you.
Exactly. And it gets even more complex because the analysis highlights intergenerational transmission. Research shows how the experiences and behaviors of one generation can biologically impact the next generation. Not through changing the DNA sequence, but through these epigenetic changes altering gene function.
That's huge. Can you share some of those examples? They sound quite striking.
Yeah, there are some powerful ones. One famous example is the Dutch winter famine during World War II. Children who were conceived during that famine showed increased risks later in life for adult diseases like diabetes, even schizophrenia, and this was linked to specific epigenetic changes, like DNA methylation patterns. Another study found that the sons of men who were prisoners of war during the U.S. Civil War actually had higher rates of dying young after age 45, suggesting effects from the father's stress. And really crucially, parental substance use, whether it's the mother or father using alcohol, cannabis, nicotine, opioids, has been linked to altered epigenetic regulation in their children. This can contribute to things like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, addiction vulnerability down the line, ADHD, other neurodevelopmental issues, even physical effects.
That is incredibly powerful. These are concrete biological ways that a parent's experience or choices can leave a measurable legacy, a physical or psychological impact that comes around in their children, maybe even grandchildren.
It really underscores this deep biological reality to the principle. And it adds this profound ethical layer to our individual choices, doesn't it? They don't just affect us, they could potentially affect the biological blueprint of future generations.
And this principle also plays out on a massive scale, doesn't it, in ecological systems?
Well, absolutely. Nature provides some really vivid examples, especially when human actions disturb the natural balance. We used to think of nature as this stable, perfectly balanced thing. But modern ecology sees it as dynamic, always adapting to disturbances. And human actions are now, well, the biggest source of disturbance globally.
And the environment responds through these feedback loops, which can amplify the effects, right?
Yes, and crucially, positive feedback loops. These are the ones where the output of a system feeds back in a way that increases the initial change. This is where small human actions can trigger these amplified, sometimes runaway effects, a really powerful environmental form of what goes around comes around.
Like the melting Arctic ice.
That's a classic example. Global warming melts ice. Ice is bright white, reflects sunlight, high albedo. When it melts, it exposes darker surfaces underneath land or open ocean water. Dark surfaces absorb more heat from the sun. This extra absorbed heat causes more warming, which melts more ice, exposing more dark surface, you see. It's a self-reinforcing loop. The initial warming action comes around to create even more warming.
And the permafrost thing, thawing, releasing methane?
Similar idea. Warming thaws permafrost, which releases huge amounts of trapped methane. Methane is a really potent greenhouse gas. More methane in the atmosphere causes more warming, which thaws more permafrost, releasing more methane. Again, an amplifying cycle. These examples show how a change, often started or worsened by human activity, doesn't just have one single consequence. It triggers a chain reaction that makes the original problem worse.
And the source material really detailed how our unsustainable environmental practices come back to bite us directly.
It's a really stark example of a negative feedback cycle of what goes around comes around. The analysis breaks down how our food systems, for instance, are massive drivers of environmental damage. They account for a huge chunk of greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, land degradation, water use, biodiversity loss.
So our actions to produce food are damaging the environment.
Exactly. And then that environmental damage returns to impact our ability to produce food and live healthy lives. Climate change, which is partly fueled by those same food systems, leads to decreased crop yields, disrupts farming patterns, makes food insecurity worse, desertification shrinks the amount of land we can farm. The analysis points to the sobering stats: millions facing hunger, especially in regions like sub-Saharan Africa that are really vulnerable to climate impacts, even though their economies rely heavily on agriculture.
It's such a clear, data-driven picture of a vicious cycle. Harmful actions against the environment boomerang back as huge societal problems like hunger and poverty. Okay, let's bring this principle down now to the level of individual human behavior and maybe how it plays out in our communities.
Right. On a personal level, just understanding that law of cause and effect gives you a sense of personal responsibility, doesn't it? Life is kind of like a complex chess game. Every move you make, every choice, is a cause that generates an effect. And the analysis really underscores that even our thoughts can be primary causes, shaping our experience of the world.
And recognizing that gives us agency, the power to shape our future. But why do people so often seem to act in ways that just disregard consequences? Breaking rules, causing harm.
The analysis digs into the psychology behind that. It mentions several factors, things like personality traits, maybe impulsivity or low conscientiousness. Your childhood environment matters too, inconsistent rules, or maybe trauma. Peer influence is huge, especially in adolescence. And then there are broader cultural factors like extreme individualism or maybe perceiving authority as unjust.
And then there are those mental shortcuts, cognitive biases that almost seem designed to help us ignore the come-around effect.
Exactly. These biases distort our judgment. They can stop us from seeing or even caring about the consequences of what we do. The analysis highlights some key ones, like confirmation bias. You only notice information that supports what you already believe, and you ignore evidence that your actions might be harmful.
Right.
Or the zero-sum bias, where you see every interaction as win-lose. That stops you seeing possibilities for cooperation and encourages harmful competition.
And the Dunning-Kruger effect. I've heard of that one.
Yeah, that's where you overestimate your own competence and dismiss what others say. It can lead to making really poor decisions with negative consequences you just didn't see coming, because you didn't realize what you didn't know.
These biases make it so much easier to just discount or, simply not even perceive the consequences.
And there's another really powerful psychological mechanism called moral disengagement. The analysis points to this as something that enables aggression, especially in conflicts between groups. Dehumanizing others, seeing them as less than human, essentially switches off our internal moral brakes, the ones that usually stop us from causing harm.
So this is part of the psychological science behind why groups might act in ways that seem designed to, get rid of other cultures, fueling these incredibly destructive cycles.
Moving out to communities, systems theory helps us see how consequences don't just stay isolated. They ripple through these interconnected networks, individuals, families, institutions. The behavior of the whole system is more than just the sum of its parts. And feedback loops within the system can reinforce behaviors, good or bad, and amplify consequences throughout.
And network theory gives us a more quantitative way to model how things spread.
Yeah, it uses graph theory to map connections between people or organizations. It shows how things like information or risk or even behaviors can spread through a population. The source mentions the SIR model, conceptually susceptible, infected, recovered, which illustrates how something introduced into a network can spread, showing how a consequence goes around a community. It also highlights how the structure of the network itself matters. Clustered networks, like social media groups, can help things spread really rapidly, especially complex behaviors that might need multiple exposures.
And game theory helps us understand that tension between what's best for the individual versus what's best for the group, especially in cooperation and conflict.
Absolutely. The classic prisoner's dilemma is the perfect example. You have two individuals acting totally rationally in their own self-interest, but they both end up with a worse outcome than if they just cooperated. It's a mathematical demonstration of how individual selfishness can lead to a collectively bad result, a fundamental what goes around comes around problem for society.
Looking back across history and different cultures, this principle just seems undeniable.
Those cross-cultural proverbs we talked about earlier, they're really powerful evidence of this human culture-created science, humanity observing these patterns and codifying them. Proverbs like the Serbian one, the pussycat will come to the tiny door, or that Chinese saying about a suffering daughter-in-law eventually becoming a harsh mother-in-law herself. They act as cultural mirrors, warnings, ethical lessons.
And on the grandest scale, the rise and fall of civilizations often seems to illustrate these long-term collective consequences catching up.
Exactly. Societal collapses are these macro-scale examples. Often, you see common factors involved: environmental degradation, running out of resources, social decay, inequality. The analysis mentions examples like the ancient Maya, or the Western Roman Empire, or the Indus Valley civilization. In different ways, collective choices and how they interacted with their environment produced consequences over long periods that fundamentally changed or even ended their societies as they knew them.
And history is just packed with specific stories, isn't it? Big and small.
Absolutely. On a personal scale, you have that grim irony of Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution, ending up executed by the very guillotine he championed. Or the legendary story of the ancient Greek ruler Phalaris, who supposedly commissioned a horrific torture device, the Bronze Bull, only to become its first victim himself. These stories, even fictional ones like Gilderoy Lockhart and Harry Potter losing his memory from his own backfiring charm, they stick with us because they capture that direct retribution so neatly.
But it's not just negative, right? Single actions, acts of defiance, can have these epic, positive, come-around effects.
Totally. The analysis points to really powerful examples. Think of Gandhi's Salt March, a single, non-violent act that helped ignite the movement for Indian independence. Or Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus. That sparked the Montgomery bus boycott and became a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement. Or even the image of the solitary tank man standing before tanks in Tiananmen Square became a global symbol of resistance. These show how individual courage can generate immense positive consequences that ripple outwards.
And the consequences of unethical actions in business or leadership seem pretty clear, too.
Oh, definitely. Think of the massive accounting fraud at Enron. It didn't just lead to the company's collapse, but spurred widespread regulatory reforms like Sarbanes-Oxley. Or that infamous United Airlines incident where a passenger was forcibly dragged off an overbooked flight. Huge PR crisis, stock price dropped, massive loss of public trust. And workplace misconduct, like harassment or fraud, it causes immediate harm to victims, obviously, but it also corrodes the entire culture, damages trust, leads to financial loss. The negative actions really do come around to harm the organization itself.
And this principle plays out on the international stage constantly. Nations' actions, or even inactions, trigger consequences maybe decades later.
The analysis gives some clear historical examples. The War of 1812 between the U.S. and Britain was directly caused by British actions like impressing sailors and restricting trade. Or the Mexican-American War, largely driven by U.S. expansionism and annexing Texas, which resulted in the U.S. gaining vast territories. A really striking example discussed is U.S. isolationism after World War I, which got deeper during the Great Depression. The analysis argues that this inaction, this failure to respond effectively to aggression by Japan and Germany in the 1930s, actually contributed to the conditions that led to World War II.
Wow.
And then, ironically, The massive mobilization needed for World War II was what finally pulled the U.S. out of the Depression and set it up as a global leader post-war. It's complex, but it shows how choices, even the choice not to act, can have profound, long-lasting global repercussions.
Understanding this deep link between action and consequence, it naturally brings up ethical questions. What does this mean for figuring out right and wrong?
Well, in moral philosophy, responsibility is really tightly linked to causality. To be considered morally responsible for an outcome, you generally need to have caused it. You need to have performed the act itself responsibly, not under duress, for example, and you need to have been reasonably able to foresee the likely consequence. The analysis points out that really analyzing causation carefully is crucial, especially when consequences are complex or delayed.
And this whole principle seems to align most directly with consequentialism in ethics, right?
Yes, exactly. Consequentialist theories judge whether an action is right or wrong based purely on its outcomes, its consequences. A right act is the one that produces the best overall consequences, like the greatest good for the greatest number in utilitarianism, or maximizing pleasure in hedonism.
So the action is judged by what comes around from it.
Precisely. But the analysis points out the challenges with this. Can you ever really know all the future consequences of an action? It's incredibly difficult. And does focusing only on the outcome risk justifying bad actions? The classic end justifies the means problem. Could you say justify harming a few if it led to a benefit for the many? It highlights the complexity of applying a purely consequence-based ethic in messy, real-world situations.
Another powerful ethical tool that seems to use this principle is universalization, asking that question, what if everybody did that?
Right. This helps us evaluate actions not just based on their individual impact, which might seem tiny, but on their collective consequence. A single person deciding not to vote might seem harmless, but if everyone did that, the democratic system collapses. It's really useful for what the analysis calls threshold problems, where the harm only really appears after enough people act in a certain way, like overfishing. It shifts the focus from just individual accountability to understanding the collective systemic impact. It helps us reason predictively about societal come-around effects.
Okay, so we've seen how these negative cycles of what goes around comes around are clearly present everywhere, from individual psychology to global systems. How do we actually work towards a more balanced universe? How do we foster the positive cycles and, lessen the negative ones?
The analysis points towards several proactive strategies. One is actually applying insights from game theory to deliberately promote cooperation.
Like that tit-for-tat strategy you mentioned.
Exactly. In situations where people interact repeatedly, that simple strategy, start by cooperating, then just mirror what your opponent did last time, proved incredibly successful in computer simulations and studies. It's sort of nice because it never desects first. It's retaliatory because it punishes defection immediately. But it's also forgiving because it returns to cooperation as soon as the opponent does. Robert Axelrod, who did a lot of that work, suggested applying these kinds of principles in policy and education to encourage cooperation.
And the analysis brought up those mathematical conditions for cooperation again.
Yes, reminding us that cooperation is more likely to stick if the probability of future interactions, WB, is greater than the cost-to-benefit ratio, CB, so WCB. And for indirect reciprocity, where reputation spreads, cooperation is favored if the probability of knowing someone's reputation, Q, is greater than that cost-to-benefit ratio, QCB. These give us concrete levers. If you can create environments where people expect to interact again and where reputations are known, you mathematically tilt the balance towards cooperation and away from selfish defection.
Beyond specific strategies like that, just building trust and social capital seems absolutely fundamental.
It really is. Reciprocal behavior is basically the engine that builds trust. Studies show high levels of reciprocity correlate strongly with more trust, intimacy, and satisfaction in relationships. The analysis also mentions mutuality, this idea of having each other's back, giving support without expecting an immediate tit-for-tat return. That builds even deeper trust and resilience in communities. Without that underlying trust, even well-intentioned actions might not reliably generate positive returns. The whole system relies on it.
And responsible governance, good policies, are obviously crucial for steering these societal consequences.
The analysis really stresses ethical leadership here. It's not just about competence. It's about moral character, integrity, honesty, transparency, accountability, having a long-term focus. Ethical leaders set the tone. They model behavior. They influence the whole culture. Unethical leadership, on the other hand, leads to disappointment, cynicism, loss of confidence, and can cause huge damage to organizations and society. Selecting leaders who actually understand and value long-term consequences is key.
And principles of just governance are about creating those positive cycles by making sure consequences and benefits are distributed fairly.
Exactly. Things like being centered on human rights, being participatory, transparent, equitable, guaranteeing justice and the rule of law, fighting corruption. Transparency and accountability, for example, reduce opportunities for abuse and corruption, which builds trust. Focusing on human rights helps eliminate discrimination. These principles help prevent those negative feedback loops like corruption getting entrenched or inequality spiraling from destabilizing society and hindering a, well, healthy, normal, prosperous culture.
Anticipatory governance sounds like a really proactive way to manage the come around.
It is. It's about shifting from just reacting to crises after they happen, to actively trying to anticipate and mitigate future threats before they escalate. This involves forecasting, using tools like predictive analytics or climate modeling, building resilience at local levels, investing in prevention, think climate-proof infrastructure, or better pandemic preparedness. By understanding the potential causal chains, you can try to intervene early to shape more favorable outcomes and prevent those negative consequences from hitting so hard, or at all. It's critical for huge challenges like climate change and public health.
And in environmental stewardship, the idea of the circular economy seems like a systemic way to create positive cycles.
Yeah, it's a great example. Instead of the old linear model of take resources, make something, throw it away, the circular economy aims to design waste out from the beginning. It keeps materials circulating at their highest possible value through repair, reuse, remanufacturing, recycling, and aims to actually regenerate natural systems. Its core principles eliminate waste and pollution, circulate products and materials, regenerate nature, create these positive feedback loops, resources get reused, natural systems heal, fostering a more balanced ecological situation.
And simply choosing sustainable food production methods can create positive environmental cycles too.
Right. Healthy soil leads to better yields, less pollution means cleaner water. Choosing sustainable practices helps break those vicious cycles we talked about earlier where habitat loss, pollution, and water overuse contribute to climate change, which then harms food systems and increases hunger and poverty.
The concept of environmental justice really highlights the unfairness in how negative consequences often land.
Definitely. The analysis points out how, often due to historical factors like segregation, polluting industries, factories, waste sites, fossil fuel infrastructure, end up being located near vulnerable communities, often communities of color or low-wealth communities. So the negative consequences about it, health problems like asthma or cancer, reduced property values, exposure to sea level rise, they come around disproportionately hard on those groups. Addressing this requires policy changes and community action to ensure environmental benefits and burdens are shared more equitably.
And finally, education and awareness seem like fundamental tools for helping us shape more positive outcomes.
Absolutely. Just understanding those cognitive biases we talked about is the first step. The analysis suggests confronting them, adapting our belief through open dialogue, building trust, seeking common ground that helps us shift from win-lose thinking towards cooperation. Educating ourselves and others about these biases is a key improvement for making more rational decisions and responding better to consequences. It improves our individual state of mind, our ability to generate positive outcomes.
And cultivating empathy and intercultural understanding sounds crucial for breaking negative cycles, especially between different groups.
It really is. Research shows increased interaction between different groups can mitigate bias and conflict. Diverse media representation, media literacy training, these can challenge stereotypes and build empathy, help people see beyond preconceived notions. Cultural exchange programs foster global understanding. Moving away from dehumanization and prejudice allows for more cooperative, positive, come-around effects in all our relationships between neighbors, communities, even countries.
So what goes around comes around.
Okay.
It really is so much more than just a simple saying.
It's this universal principle echoing across philosophy, physics, biology, ecology, human behavior, history, ethics, pretty much everywhere you look.
It's there in cosmic laws, social norms, our biological inheritance, ecological feedback loops, individual choices, collective actions, historical patterns. And the consequences, as we've seen, can be incredibly complex, often delayed, sometimes amplified, and tangled up in surprising ways.
But, and this is crucial, the analysis consistently comes back to this central takeaway. While negative consequences are definitely a powerful reality, we as humans possess this unique capacity for conscious, proactive action.
We have the agency, the ability to steer towards more positive outcomes by embracing things like ethical leadership, implementing just governance, adopting sustainable practices, using anticipatory planning, and really fostering education, awareness, and empathy.
You know, the very existence of this principle as a human culture-created science, as the analysis puts it, is maybe the most optimistic part. It shows humanity's long history of observing, learning from, and adapting to the predictable nature of consequences.
It's this ongoing process of human thinking, learning, applying this understanding. That's key to refining our relationship with this principle and to building a better future, a more balanced universe, really starting with the causes we choose to put out into the world ourselves.
So the question remains for all of us, doesn't it? What will you choose to put out there?
This is DigitView.